Welcome back to Taking the Supply Chain Pulse. I'm Megan with St. Ange Company, and thanks for tuning in. Today, we're revisiting a powerful conversation from Season 1 that continues to hit home. Fred connects with Kim Jones, one of our own and nationally recognized sterile processing experts, to unpack what's happening across this essential part of healthcare operations. If you missed it the first time or want a fresh listen, the insights are just as timely as ever. Now here's your host, Fred Kranz.
Why don't you tell us about yourself, your background, how you got started, and how you've worked to where you are today?
Sure. Well, thank you. I obviously started my career not in sterile processing, but as you mentioned, I had the good fortune right out of college to find a position in human resources with a very well-known organization here in Central Ohio. I got that position as a recruiter in HR, and my areas of accountability were sterile processing and the operating room. So I always say of my 30-year career, the majority of it has been spent in sterile processing in the operating room, in or around those areas. So you may ask how that goal or how that position in human resources ended me up in sterile processing. I worked for a few years supporting the operating room in sterile processing from an HR recruitment perspective, as well as some employee relations mixed in there. I went out on maternity leave to have my first baby. And when I came back, there was an SPD educator position that had been writing my position roster the entire time I was out. So I met with the director, who I had a great relationship with, and we walked through the department. I, was trying to get from her what exactly she was looking for so that it would help me to better recruit for them. And by the end of that visit, I was pretty fascinated by all of this reprocessing that happened. I obviously knew part of the job because I recruited for it, but at the magnitude and the volume, that facility was a 32-room OR. And so it was just an immense operation. And so at the end of that visit, at the end of that conversation, the director pitched the idea, hey, why don't you take this position? People respond well to you. You're teachable. We can teach you the business. You have the people skills. So that's how it kind of started. So my first position was an educator. That was back in around 2005, 2006. There was a big push, lots of lobbying going on to make certification mandatory in New York and New Jersey at that time. And so we were leading the pack in Central Ohio. I became certified, wrote an education program, and we were able to get about 70% of the staff certified at that time. And I really, really enjoyed watching people respond as they were learning why we do the things we do, not just how we do the things that we do in sterile processing. So I held that position for several years, and then I really started to get interested in operational leadership. So a manager position in that very department became available. So I threw my hat in the ring and I was given that position. I had a large number of FTEs, about 80 full-time FTEs that reported up through me. And I held that position for a few years, 3 to 5 years, I believe. And then I was actually invited to join the OR team as a non-clinical manager in the operating room. And that was really a gift to me. Being able to see the full cycle of how the patients come in and how the work that we do in sterile processing can affect the metrics that the operating room uses to remain efficient. And so I was really able to see how that ecosystem of perioperative services includes sterile processing. And I ended up having the non-clinical team at first, anesthesia techs, OR techs, anything non-clinical in the operating room reported to me. And then halfway through my tenure there, I was given the clinical staff. I had off-shift clinical teams, afternoon, evenings, and weekend clinical teams. And that was great because, as a sterile processing leader, we often hear the complaints of the operating room. But once I was able to lead those clinical staff, I was able to understand how 5 minutes of a wait affects their entire process in the operating room, or how delays from a sterile processing perspective can back the schedule up. And the surgeons then have to operate with a whole new team because their first shift team leaves. And so all of that just kind of helped to enable my thought process, and also continue to feed, even though I wasn't in sterile processing anymore, just the importance of sterile processing and a fluid, efficient process in sterile processing will then translate to the same in the operating room. I held that position for a few years, and then I was actually recruited to another Central Ohio health system who is quite large. There I was accountable for 49 ORs and for major hospitals under one roof, if you will, and then acquired a community hospital and several same-day surgery hospitals. And while I had my tenure there, I was able to work with the St. Ange team, and we developed an offsite reprocessing center. And that was really kind of taking all of my experience and putting it into something new and innovative. And that was a really great experience, being able to see that process from start to finish. So then I left that organization and thought, what am I going to do with all of this experience that I've gathered? And I threw my hat in the ring for some consulting, and I started my own consulting firm. And, I've had the good fortune of working with several large IDNs across the country over the last year and a half. Projects ranging from process improvement with high-level disinfection, team building, leadership, mentoring, leadership development, change management. Had some opportunity in the last year and a half out on my own to be able to contribute to equipment planning and some standard operating procedure writing for a very large IDN looking at building an offsite reprocessing center. And then I most recently finished up again with the good fortune of being partnered with St. Ange to work for another very prestigious IDN that's mostly here in Ohio, doing audits on process improvements, taking a look at opportunities to standardize. And that was a very large project. We had a tight timeline, and continue to just be able to use the skills that I have in partnership with other sterile processing professionals as well as engineers. So I've had a great last year and a half, and I feel like it really has just helped me take all of my experience. And what I enjoy the most about what I do now is when I go into a new place and there's perhaps a director that's struggling, or a director that feels like they're at the end of their rope, they've tried everything. It's really gratifying to be able to say, I've been in your seat and I've sat in your chair and I know how you're feeling, and to be able to contribute to their success has been something that I've really enjoyed over the last year and a half. So that's where I am now.
Great. Well, you have a unique collection of experiences. Starting out, the HR experience really comes into play here because you have perioperative experience, you have central sterile processing experience, and you have the people experience. So, for example, that the folks in CS are usually among the lowest paid, lowest appreciated, least appreciated folks in the hospital. And when you see that, there's another thing that you understand that many people don't, and that is that the dependencies. The OR can't do surgery unless CS does its job. CS can't do its job unless the supply chain fulfills their needs to get CS the equipment and supplies they need to do their job. There are these there are these relationships, and yet my experience, and as I said the other day, my friend Ed Hiscock said there are many supply chains in healthcare, not just one. There's a supply chain, there's a pharmacy supply chain, there's a food service supply chain, there's an environmental service supply chain. Every department or every function likes to be standalone and take care of its own problems. And my observation, I'll take this off your shoulders, my observation over the years is that OR is always fighting with CS, OR is always fighting with the regular supply chain. What do you see as the most frequent disconnects among these three organizations, OR, CS, and regular supply chain, and how do you go about working to improve those?
I can 100% agree with you. And I do feel like my experience has given me the opportunity to see different veins of this supply chain, when they're highly functioning, and the communication is high functioning. And then I've had the opportunity to see where there's lacking. And again, to your point, where there's the finger pointing and everyone wants to pass the buck, which is human nature. And I think that my time in the operating room gave me the opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, to see how important all of the supporting departments for the operating room truly are. And I was able to also see the pressure that the OR was under to make things happen, and to make them happen on time. To answer your question simply, Fred, I believe that a lack of understanding of what our independent roles actually are accountable for, and some of the barriers that within those independent entities, sterile processing, operating room, supply chain, some of the barriers that exist within our own personal sets of accountability are often not articulated out. So what I mean by that is, what I've seen in organizations is a lack of partnership in those three major entities. So the operating room, the sterile processing department, and supply chain. And I believe that happens from the top down. So if you have collaboration among the leaders with operating room, sterile processing, and supply chain, as leaders, we are accountable to push that down. And we are accountable then to stop the blaming, stop the finger pointing. And how that happens is frequent meetings, frequent touch bases, open lines of communication, being able to have a mechanism to proactively let the departments that enable our success know, hey, we've had a ton of call-offs in the last 24 hours. We're going to have your first cases ready for you. Our manager will keep in close contact with you throughout the day to let you know what it's looking like for us. And then having an operating room leader that understands and respects that and says, what can we do to help you? We get that you're having some issues today. The same thing that, and that's on the frontline level. The same thing can happen, and I've seen it function very well. Supply chain, having a adequate mechanism to inform when we have back stocks, when something's been replaced, when locations have been moved. And again, I believe that all of that comes from the top down. So organizations must task their leaders with open lines of communication, support, and when and where a toxic environment exists. Sadly, everyone from the top down feels that toxic environment, and that just contributes to the lack of accountability and the blame game. So I believe that the largest disconnect is communication as well as education about what the enabling departments are accountable for, and an openness and a willingness to support one another in times when we're overtasked, we're stressed, we have, a lack of resources from a people perspective. I think that, we can't be afraid to just reach out and say, hey, I need some help.
Yeah, it's I'm listening to that, and I'm thinking of the OR environment, if you will. And I'm probably showing my age when I talk about this, but When I first came into supply chain, the OR nurse was sort of on the tip of the spear, if you will. Uh, the OR produces a significant amount of revenue. Many of the highest and best reimbursed procedures are done in the OR, so they got to get them done. That OR director is working with people who have egos that don't fit in most buildings, and who historically, up until recent years, have always had the leverage to get what they want when they want it, not get what they need when they need it, which is an entirely different thing. So it becomes really important to build relationships and to educate the clinicians and the doctors. How have you gone about doing that?
I've had the good fortune in the organizations that I worked for that, the sterile processing manager, sterile processing director, is the first line of defense really for the team. So I've had the good fortune that in both of the organizations I spent my entire tenure, surgeons were very vocal when they had an issue. In one experience, I had vocal surgeons who would, to your point, go to the OR manager, OR director, and the OR director would come to me, give me the opportunity to fix it. And there was that open line of communication. And so the surgeons, we partnered together. And that didn't start off in the very beginning. I think you have to earn that. You have to earn their trust. And I think in so doing, you are then able to have their trust that you're handling an issue. What is very important to make sure that cohesive relationship and that trust factor is created in a very authentic way is that the operating room leaders have to support the sterile processing leaders. Otherwise, the surgeons, to your point, it takes a huge ego to take somebody into a room and essentially have them, dead on the table, really, to fix their problem, patch them up, sew them back up. That takes a huge amount of confidence and ego. So, it kind of goes with the territory. However, I believe that they're still human beings and they still need to understand the why behind something. If I don't have the support of an operating room leader, when I go to a surgeon and try to explain the why in my department, he feels that I'm just not taking accountability because it hasn't been, there's not a cohesive relationship between the sterile processing leader and the OR. When there's a cohesive relationship and the trust is there, when that surgeon goes and he is complaining again to the OR leader, I get the call, hey, Dr. So-and-so is upset about such and such. We backed him off, but hopefully you can look into this and let me know what's going on. End of story. And so, I think that, that in and of itself is a huge challenge. And when I'm out in, across the country working with sterile processing leaders, one of the first questions I ask them is, what's your support like from the OR? Because without that support, we've got a lot of work to do in sterile processing and as a sterile processing leader. But when a leader is able to tell me that they do have tremendous support, then, half the battle is won then, because then it becomes process improvement, team building within our own entity. But when we have to work on correcting that relationship with the operating room, that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of, accountability. It takes a lot of education. So, I think the sheer nature of what I do and that question being a primary question shows you how important communication is and just trust and collaboration.
Yeah, but that's the problem that's got to be solved. That's for sure.
Before we dive back in, you may be asking yourself, is my supply chain future ready? At St. Company, we don't just optimize logistics, we engineer smarter, leaner, and more resilient systems from end to end. From manufacturing to retail to healthcare, our experts bring decades of experience and cutting-edge strategies to transform your operations. Visit and discover how we're shaping the future of supply chain, one solution at a time.
So when you worked with St. Ange on a couple of really large projects, one was the development of an offsite processing center, and the other one was an audit of a very prestigious systems sterile processing function. When you walked into these places who, if we mentioned their name, we go, oh my God, that's really something. What did you discover in there that surprised you, and what stuff did you discover that didn't surprise you?
I think that what surprised me was that these prestigious organizations are still working under a very archaic assumption that sterile processing is simply washing items, right? And that it is a, Toyota Lean Six Sigma, if we implement lean processes, then we should be perfect. And I believe that in one scenario, that was the belief of one of the health systems. And what happened in that scenario was, making a car with the Toyota Six Sigma prescription is much different than getting a tray down from the operating room with 100 parts and pieces and having to sift through that. There's no assembly line because there's no taking into account that the peripheral processes that enable sterile processing success have not been addressed prior to implementing such a system that, is believed to be assembly and foolproof. And, if we just do it the way it's prescribed, then, we should be able to be deemed successful. And I was surprised that one of those organizations still felt that was the answer to the issue without looking at the peripheral processes. Was point of use cleaning happening in the OR? Was the OR sending trays back complete to sterile processing? That was not a consideration. And so sterile processing was set up to fail in that scenario because we had not made sure that our customers were held accountable to do what they needed to do. And the other idea, and I was surprised to see that, compensation rates are still so low. The infrastructure of the department is lacking in the areas of education, onboarding, educational programs, adequate numbers of FTEs being assigned to a singular leader, and that still many of the departments did not have the adequate resources to handle the daily volume. And when you drill down in and start to understand that, across the country, many organizations use a metric of procedures performed in surgery that will dictate how many FTE we need to process instrumentation in sterile processing. And what I have struggled with for years to try to help administrators understand is volume does not equal volume. So if I have 30, GI cases or, general GU cases, and I have 30 ortho cases, there is a vast difference in the amount of parts and pieces that sterile processing is going to be accountable for. And so it just surprises me, I think, that across the country, we see that while surgery has advanced and become very technical and very complex, and instrumentation has also become very complex and very innovative, we have not taken a look at the educational component for our sterile processing techs. We have not taken into consideration how much they're actually making. These people are under a tremendous amount of pressure, tremendous. And they're still making an entry-level wage that's not much higher than the housekeeper in the hospital environment. So I think those are the things that surprised me. I believe that, working with these two very prestigious organizations, that I would see, they got it. They understand that, in order to have a successful operation, we have to appreciate and retain and incentivize our sterile processing team. And that just was not the case. So I think in a nutshell, that was my experience.
Yeah, and the other day in our conversation, when you're talking about the low level of pay and the low level of appreciation for the difficulty of the task in sterile processing, you mentioned the fact that folks are going outside for other jobs. One of which was you can make $19 an hour at the car wash, and you're lucky to make $15 an hour at the cart wash, which is
Right.
only one letter difference when you look at it. But the difference is, if you screw up at the car wash, you may put a scrape on the side of a car. If you screw up in the cart wash, you can kill people, and it's that simple. So
Correct.
that sort of transitions to two things. And sort of last part of this conversation. Number one is, where do you see robotics coming into sterile processing to assist the people there? Do you see that something that's happening?
I do a lot of reading. I try to stay up on the latest technologies and so on. And, in my experience, I think I shared with you the other day, I have never managed a small operation or directed a small operation. I believe that the vast variation in tray size and weight and movement of our own human resources, people actually doing the job. I have seen where, especially in decontamination, where there's lots of twisting and turning to get things in the sink, out of the sink. Some of that automation using robotics, there's opportunity to move trays using robots. There's automation for trays entering into the washer and coming out of the washer. I think those types of ergonomic robotic assistance is going to really take off over the next few years. As an operational leader with a lot of years under my belt, seen so many injuries or so many ongoing, individuals that can't work in a certain place because they've hurt their back too many times, so on and so forth. So I do believe that component is taking off, and I think larger facilities are going to start using that, because ultimately it saves the human resources from injury and harm. From an AI perspective, and I don't know if that's kind of what we're thinking as well, being able to dump an entire tray out on a pad of technology, if you will, and it's able to sort of spit out with if all the contents of the tray are there. That's all well and good. However, I don't know if the technology is advanced to this degree, but there'll, in my mind, never be, in my lifetime, a replacement for actual human expertise to take a look at these instruments to see if their efficacy of the instrument is adequate, if the cleanliness is adequate. I think that we will always rely on people to do that job. But I do think that technology and robotics have grown leaps and bounds. And so I make that statement loosely, and could very likely be proven wrong in my lifetime, that there would be, a robot that could do anything that a human can do. It's, at this point in our history, we're seeing so many advances. But right now, I believe strongly that the human element of sterile processing is very important from an inspection perspective.
So would it be fair to say that the shortest list in the world might be healthcare systems that have sterile processing, in which the sterile processing operational process couldn't be improved? And would it also be fair to say that if you're considering doing anything, you start with an assessment, and get a real good look at what the options are, what the opportunities are, where your organization's going with a strategic plan, and tie all that together. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. And I think that there are technologies that could, for the benefit and the bottom line of an organization, if they're going to invest, several $100,000 in robotics in a sterile processing department, would that yield any savings as far as human resources? I believe that that is certainly something that from a strategic plan would come into play. I do believe that exactly what you said, research and, doing some, true evidence-based research. Who's using this? How's it working for them? What's the repair rates look like? All of that, because we know that when we rely on, even when we rely on our electricity and we're hit with a thunderstorm, we got to figure it out. Well, when you're running an operation that's feeding 49, 52, 32 operating rooms, and you have a piece of equipment go out in sterile processing, it's not as easy as just running to find a candle. So
Right.
I think that all of that has to be taken into consideration when we go with new technologies and new advances in technology. I think we really need to take a look at what's that downtime look like, and how are we going to compensate for that? If we cut our human resources, where does our compensation then come from?
Right. Well, that sort of brings me to the last sort of formal question here is the pandemic really was really cut a path through healthcare, human resources.
Mhm.
The traveling nurses had to save the day in many places, quite honestly.
Mhm.
Depending on where the pandemic went, they sort of followed that. Uh, how are travelers shown up in sterile processing, and is that a thing that needs to be dealt with? Could you talk about that?
I sure can. So, I believe that the travelers, the amount of travelers that we saw across the country after the pandemic and the years that have followed have largely increased for sterile processing techs, and that is really in part due to, and I think in large part due to the compensation. They can go and they can do this job and they can feed their families. They can make enough money to pay down debt. They may make enough money to put their kids through college. They can, in some very sad situations, get off government assistance when they go and do traveling jobs. So I really believe that this is very cyclical. Did the pandemic highlight it? Very much so. However, I believe that the biggest problem with retaining retention and recruitment is how much these people are being paid. They're being asked to be certified or to become certified. And again, they're just making a few dollars more than the guy that's sweeping the floor in housekeeping. So when they're asked to, would they join in with a travel agency, the travel agency is sending them to places where they're very needed, and they can go there and they can make money. And, my hope is that they feel appreciated when they're there, so they feel appreciated and they continue to extend their contracts. I believe that this problem, the root of the problem, is that administrators within healthcare have never caught up with, if surgery is going to be the revenue generating engine of your health system, then what are you doing for the people that are feeding that revenue generating engine of the hospital? The surgeon can come to work and he can have 10 cases lined up for that day that's going to yield the hospital hundreds of thousands of dollars. But if he doesn't have his basic tools in working order and in sterile and ready for those patients, he's not making anybody any money. And the OR staff, they're not educated to do the work of a sterile processing tech. So I believe that the disconnect between the people that are actually providing the tools for the clinical team to do their job, to then feed the revenue generating engine of the health system so that the administrators can make their bottom line, I think where they are lacking is that fundamental first step of making sure that your sterile processing techs are adequately paid, they're appreciated, There's a retention program in place for them. There's an education program in place for them. And so many facilities just see it as just do more. You have a manager in the department, so the manager can take an assignment today. The supervisor can take an assignment today. I believe wholeheartedly that sterile processing is the place where many administrators look at where are we going to cut some expense so that we can then get more scrub techs to scrub these additional cases that we're going to put on. We can get more nurses to scrub and to circulate. They're taking from the wrong place, because what happens, as you well know, with a history in sterile processing, we get behind in sterile processing, and who ultimately suffers? Ultimately, our patients suffer, but the metrics in the operating room start to crash the minute we don't have adequate resources in sterile processing. So I believe that organizations that spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on travelers, it amazes me if they would look inward and they would take a look and dive deeper into why do we have 30% travelers in our organization? Why can't we retain people? If you have adequate leadership in place, the blame doesn't fall on the leader. It falls on the leader. Can only do what they are equipped to do, what the organization has given them the resources to be successful. If you are not given the really the respect by the organization as their sterile processing leader, when you go to your administration and you say, I see what you're telling me on paper, but that's not the scenario, I think that's where they're shooting themselves in the foot. And I think that's why the traveling population has exploded. They're not paid enough. They don't feel appreciated. And it's a never ending cycle in some organizations. And sadly, I've seen that.
Yeah, well, just to sum up, because once again, we get back to this whole idea of an assessment. Most of my experience in healthcare, and probably most of yours, has been people that our cases are made narratively without data. I need more people in CFs. We have from and you try to tell a doctor, hey, you don't understand. There's a difference between this case and this case is what it requires. And unless you have someone in to help you gather the data and build the case, all you appear to be doing to the people in the C-suite is making excuses and whining. And what your recommendation that I've gotten out of what we've just been talking about is, number one, for the organization to respect the function. Number two, to provide enough resources to do the job. And number three, to pay those resources enough so that they won't have to become travelers to make money to live their life normally. Was that fair to say?
Very fair to say. And, I understand that, from an administrative C-suite perspective, they feel that they should not be in the weeds, that, sterile processing leaders should be able to tell the story. And to your point, have data to back that up. In my experience, that's 100% true. Data is wonderful to tell the story. It tells part of the story. It doesn't tell the part of the story that point of use cleaning is lacking in our operating room, which requires additional resources in SPD. Your preference cards are wrong. So 30% of what we sent you sent it right back to us. And that took 30% of our resources to develop those trays and create that case card. And then it was just basically, for naught, wasn't needed. And so I believe that the more we can advocate for change and assessments and engage our administrative C-suite people to understand that while some organizations probably, it would be naive to say there aren't leaders that would just, pass the buck or blame their team or so on. There are leaders, if somebody has achieved a level of director of sterile processing, they care about what they're doing and they know what they're doing. And I believe that they need to have the respect of the C-suite to sit down and listen. The minute the problems present and they're outside of the realm of that director's control or that manager's control, the C-suite needs to humble themselves and sit and listen, and not just make those assessments from their data or historical benchmarking, all the buzzwords that we hear in our industry.
Well, Kim, thank you for coming back for the second time. I just want to, before we go, I did a big on-site project at an organization in the South in must have been around 2000, 2002. They were returning 45% of the stuff that was sent up to surgery back unused. And that was the stuff that came back. Remember, what you haven't talked about is the stuff that got thrown away because it got opened and had to be thrown away, couldn't be used again. But 45% was coming back. And I was talking to those people about 3 years ago, and they said that they've worked really hard to implement the stuff that we talked about, and they've got it down to 42% now. So they've really made a vast improvement. So it's still, the problems are still there. But Kim, thanks so much for shining the light on sterile processing. This has been a great conversation, and we hope to have you back again in the future. Thank you so much.
I would be honored, Fred, and thank you. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon.
Well, that's all for today. Thanks so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button and connect with us online so you'll never miss an episode and can catch up on all the ones you might have missed. Got a topic you're fired up about, or maybe you want to be a guest on the show? Fred would love to hear from you. Just reach out at fcrans@stonge.com. We'll see you next time.